Thank you, FutureBelt, for inviting me. One of the challenges, this being my third time, is to not repeat things that I've said before, since many of you have already heard me speak. And the ask that you wanted me to speak about, the task that you gave to me, was to talk about mobility revolutions. What are the revolutions that we're facing now, and what do we need to know from a planning perspective, from a city perspective, from a national perspective? I represent an organization that works for 59 member countries around the world, including Norway, but also including China and India. Mobility revolutions, that's a huge request. Honestly, it's one that I don't feel terribly qualified to speak about, because we're in the midst of a revolution, and it's always quite hard to describe changes that are going around you with any clear certainty. I suspect that many of those that are younger than I am, and so many of you that are less than 54 now, will be living through these revolutions, and maybe when you come to the end of your careers, you'll be able to look back and say, we were right about certain things and we were wrong about others. But I'll talk about three things today. They are not expansive, they're not exhaustive, but they're three elements that we are talking a lot to our countries about when it comes to thinking about how mobility is changing. One of those things is actually a caveat, and I'll talk about slogans and the role of slogans in any revolution, but in particular when it comes to the type of revolution that we're seeing in mobility. I'll talk a bit about what we are looking into as the potential for shared mobility services. I spoke a little bit about that last time, but I'd like to share some more information and more outcomes of our research. And then I'd like to talk about respacing, something that is in fact probably invisible to all of you, but that is really essential when we think about how our cities will be functioning in the future. So first, about slogans. Every revolution needs a slogan. And the slogans are useful because they help focalize our attention on what's essential. But they also can be a bit of propaganda, and they can mislead us in some ways. We've heard this slogan today, and there is, if you ever go to an urban futures conference or a transport futures conference, you will not avoid hearing this slogan. And that slogan is smart everything now. Everything has to be smart. Our phones are smart. Our vehicles have to be smart. Our bicycles need to be smart. Our cities need to be smart. And it's hard to avoid this. And it's extraordinary that we've gotten so far being quite dumb or less smart than we aspire to. So smart everything now. That's important because sometimes when we think about what smart means, a smart city, it is an image of hyper-efficiency, of an almost antiseptic world in which we've designed all the errors out of human interactions. We've designed all the friction out of our transport systems. We have become these sort of uber, and I'm not talking about the company, uber-efficient beings. And part of that comes from the way in which we've addressed making buildings smarter, making buildings machines for living, making buildings machines for work, making buildings machines. And we think that if we're able to achieve this for the city, then we've accomplished something. We've really gone forward, and we're really on the path to a successful city. I studied anthropology, and one of the things that comes to my mind when I hear a discourse around smart cities is that ignores everything that we know that has made cities successful. Cities aren't successful because they're smart. Cities are successful because they're messy, because they're a bit chaotic, they're oftentimes dirty, and the great catalyst for innovation and for thinking comes from the margins of the buildings, the spaces in between the buildings, the space that we don't plan, the space that we allow human interactions to create something, to create human society, to create new ideas that keep us moving forward. And that space is something that we find in every city, but it's a space that we often overlook. And as a cautionary note, when we think about transport systems, but as we think about cities as well, I would encourage us all to be humble about the role that design can play and the role that engineering can play in making a successful city. Certainly, and we heard this morning from Jennifer, that we can design a lot into our cities, but we can't design a successful city. And we can engineer a lot into our transport systems, but we can't engineer a system that allows human interactions to occur, as well as when we back off in some cases. So that is my caveat. Let's think about that slogan when we hear it, and let's keep in mind that the smart city is a city that doesn't necessarily function without any friction. It's not necessarily a city that is clean, a city that is one that is hyper-efficient, but one that functions as a social space for people. And when we think about moving in the city, oftentimes we have this idea of efficiency, and that efficiency is often translated into speed. The transport space in our cities are seen as conduits, as pipes for moving vehicles, for moving cars, for moving trucks. In cities like Copenhagen, it's for moving bicycles as well. But speed is not necessarily what mobility is about. And that's something that we keep forgetting about. Mobility is not about the moving. What we get from mobility is not about going from point A to point B. It's about what we do when we stop moving. It's about sitting down. It's about thinking, talking, creating with other people. And that doesn't happen when we're moving. That happens when we get to places. And getting to places and creating places where these interactions can take place don't only involve making the city faster, more efficient. It makes the city, in some cases, less successful when we only focus on moving people in vehicles. So let's be careful about the slogan. But of course, we do need to move around the city. And when that movement takes place, we have to keep in mind that it's not movement for movement's sake. It's moving to access things, moving to access other people, to access job opportunities, to access resources, to access childcare facilities, healthcare facilities, educational facilities. We do move in the city. And up until recently, our choices for moving around have been relatively limited. Walking, cycling, public transport, and cars for the last 100 years. And now that we can see in many cities around the world, Oslo is no exception, there are a number of new ways of moving and new ways of organizing movement in the city, including more flexible forms of public transport, bicycle sharing, car sharing, ride services like Uber, like Didi Chuxing in China. All this is enabled by this layer of digitalization that is infusing our cities and makes not just this possible, but makes us able to work and access the city differently in ways that we couldn't before. And coming down the pipeline, when? I have no idea, although I have driven in many automated or sat in many automated vehicles, is the idea that many of these modes can ultimately be automated. In the discussion, we'll come back to this, because I think there's some real questions that we have to ask about automation. And the basic question is, if automation is an answer, what was the question? And that's something that we don't have a clear answer on. And taking the drive route isn't the only thing. It's also helping machines or creating machines that can start making decisions and thinking and learning from their own experience. The artificial intelligence, the application of artificial intelligence into our transport systems, into our cities writ large, is something that we don't yet understand, but that will, we believe, have an impact on the way in which mobility services are delivered and ultimately the way in which we move around our cities. All of these are converging together. And they're not just converging in the transport space, they're converging across a number of domains, in planning, in healthcare, in education, and of course in transport. And in many of those domains, we're seeing this dematerialization of these services into a service. And you can see a number of these here: healthcare as a service, education as a service, energy as a service, banking as a service, and mobility as a service. This is a bit like automated driving. Many people talk about it, but it's actually hard to see on our streets today. We do believe there's a lot of potential to this. Idea of dematerializing transport into a seamless set of services that you can access according to what you're willing to pay for and what your immediate needs are. In fact, when you think about mobility as a service, there are a number of definitions, but my colleague Peter Morlion from the city of Ghent has probably the most intriguing one, but I think the most accurate one. And that is that mobility as a service is a bit like Grand Theft Auto, but a very virtuous version of Grand Theft Auto, where as you walk through the city, you're not stealing vehicles, you're not accessing motorbikes, you're not taking public transport without paying, but everything that you see that can move, you have access to. you have access to seamlessly. You don't have to think about the payment. You can go from the tram to the shared bike to perhaps the ride service, and walking, of course, but that is free still. So a virtuous version of Grand Theft Auto. But it is a difficult thing to actually deliver because we have all these modes, and we have you and I that we need to access these modes. And the way in which we've done this in the past is through these different specific bilateral relationships that we've created. And those are full of friction, they're full of costs, and they make mixing these together quite difficult and quite burdensome. There's a cognitive load to using all these. And that is where the promise of having a platform, a single intermediary where you can bring all these services together and have access seamlessly as an individual across all these services has great potential. A single mobility as a service platform is the holy grail. It's not what's happening. This is what's happening. I like to call this the platform wars. Didi Xuxing has a platform in China. Lyft and Uber have platforms in the markets where they are. Various public transport operators are trying to pull the blanket to them and create their own mobility as a service platform. And we find a situation where the competition for you and I is really great. And in that competition, a lot of mobility services are left off of the table because we're trying to focus on providing those that are already in a specific platform that each operator has already in their platform. That, we don't believe, is a model going forward. The platform war approach is one where you have great risks for monopolies being created that would reduce the amount of choice that people have, not increase the amount of choice. And part of that is because the way in which we organize data around mobility as a service hasn't much left the 2000s. When we talk about mobility as a service, we're still very much in a Microsoft Excel world, where we have to have the spreadsheet, we have to have a ledger, and each operator has their ledger, and then they validate each other's riders, services, payments, etc. We have just completed a large-scale scan of what digital ledger technologies like, and I hesitate to use the word because it's going to focus you on something that you probably shouldn't focus on, like blockchain. Digital ledger technologies is a way of democratizing access to information. Blockchain is, we don't believe, the way forward, but it is an interesting way of structuring data so that data can talk to data, so that people can go from one service to another and have automatic transactions record their movement from a tram to a shared bicycle system to a taxi if they want that. IOTA is one of those, the IOTA Tangle. There are many, many other forms of distributed ledger technologies that create the potential for a really meshy, not messy, but meshy mass mobility as a service environment, where depending on what you want and depending on what your needs are, you can create your own packages of services without having to require or without requiring a platform to curate that for you. Meshy mass is one way of democratizing mobility as a service away from this platform model and into a model that works for all of us individually. But it requires certain things, and those things that are required are on the side of governments. It requires answering 3 questions: who, what, where, with a great degree of trust. And that's where distributed ledger technologies, the amount of trust that you can build into those helps out. Who? Digital IDs. You can look over to the east. Estonia has established a digital ID register for their country. That's already happening. Not necessarily for mobility as a service, but the underpinnings of that will enable mobility as a service. An open standard and mandatory set of pieces of information that all licensed operators have to provide. That answers the what service, when is it available, under what conditions, at what cost. Finland, your not Scandinavian neighbor, but your Nordic neighbor, has put this in place with the reform of their transport code, where operators are now required to give information on their transport services in an open fashion, in a standardized way. And finally, where? That is something that is oftentimes part of the questioning around mobility as a service, but we need a way of saying where things are, where they're going, where they're geofenced, and that requires a new way of thinking about space, and I'll come back to that in a bit. Last time I came, I spoke a bit about the work that we did on sharing, and part of the emerging dialogue between what's public transport and what's individual transport. And I think we are suggesting that our countries need to get beyond thinking about public or individual, but more into actually what is the use form? Is it, do I own it? If I own it, then it's private. Do I just access it? Do I use it for 10 minutes, for an hour? Is it a bus? Is it a shared bike? Well, then it's something else. That is probably a more relevant way of looking at the split between public and private transport. But clearly for cars, as I noted last time I came, as we heard this morning, are underused capital assets. So they're used less than an hour a day. And when they're used, they're 80% not used because they're mostly empty. We looked into a number of sharing profiles. I'll describe them each here, different shared mobility modes. One is a door-to-door shared taxi type of operation. Another one is an on-demand public transport type of operation. And the third one is traditional heavy rail or high-density bus transport. Now, I talked about this last time, and what I said last time was true, but we've extended this work to a number of other contexts. Last time we had just looked at Lisbon. Now we've looked at Helsinki, Auckland, and Dublin. We're doing it also for Lyon and also for a large city in North America. But the findings are relatively consistent. And that is that the first thing that happens when you completely replace, and that is also a large leap, but when you completely replace all car trips and most poor performing public transport trips, you see a huge reduction in the number of vehicles that you need, 3% in the case of Lisbon. But you can see that for all of the cities that we've looked at, you see at least a 96 to 97% reduction in the number of cars necessary to carry out all the trips that are carried out by cars today. That is an important number. It's an important number because it eliminates the need to park cars on the street. That space in many cities represents about 25% of the actual street curb-to-curb space. And that is a huge amount of space that when you remove it, creates a number of new opportunities. And opportunities for us to do things that we want to do, but we can't do right now. Part of that is giving more space to active mobility, more space to walking, more space to cycling, more space to pushing your pram in streets, on streets, without having to worry about having a huge amount of vehicles. But it also gives us an opportunity to think about new uses of that space, informal uses of that space, like these parklets in Philadelphia, or other forms of uses for offloading goods, for example. Another thing that happens when you ghost out 96% of the cars in a city is that you might think that the traffic impacts would be quite large. And what we found is that with the right type of optimization in all of those 4 cities, you could see a large reduction in the number of vehicle kilometers traveled to deliver the same number of trips. Now, this was the case of Lisbon, 48%, so a halving, basically, of all the vehicle kilometers traveled in a city in Lisbon. But when we looked at the other cities, we saw similar results, between 30 and 60% for the city that we're looking at. So there is a huge amount of travel reduction, and this results in a large amount of CO2 emissions for the same mobility. And I'll come back to that in a bit, because the same is something that is a public policy piece to deliver. There has to be some managing of that freed up space. One of the things that came out when we started doing this work was, is this an extinct or soon to be extinct species? Is public transport, as we know it now, bus-based transport largely, something that we will no longer have in our cities? And the answer is, it depends, but no, in most cases, because a lot of what public transport can do, it cannot do without, other forms of mobility services like the ones that we modeled cannot do as well. What we saw is in every city, the use of public transport increased. In some cases, quite a bit, like in Auckland, almost 700%. Well, that's partly because in Auckland, people don't use much public transport. But in the other cities, 30 to 50% an increase in public transport use. So this future of having a more on-demand ride service, micro on-call public transport fleet is not incompatible with the type of public transport operations that we have today. It does require rethinking where those services are, what type of vehicles we use, and how they're articulated between the different service providers, ideally in this sort of mobility as a service mesh. And access. Clearly, we heard about the importance of social equity. Access is one of the ways in which we gain value from our cities, and we looked across all of our cities on what are the access impacts of this type of mobility system. And this is a case of Helsinki, looking at the number of jobs that are available within 30 minutes from each grid point in the city. And what you can see is today, using public transport, the redder it is, the fewer jobs are accessible. If you look at a ride service, shared mobility service scenario, as we did, with the heavy-duty rail and bus rapid transit systems, you see a big increase in the level of accessibility. A big increase that we see in all of our cities, or the cities that we looked at, up to, in the case of Lisbon, almost 600% increase in accessibility. And that has really important equity considerations for the whole of the city. And I'd like to close about talking about this issue of respacing. And it's something that came up when we were doing our work, because one of the things that we saw is that when we move to a city where more and more mobility may be shared with existing public transport, with bicycles, with shared bicycles, with ride services, then we see a different configuration for something that we never look at, which is the curb, which is the interface space between the pavement or the sidewalk and the street space. And that is a highly contested space today. Here you can see in Barcelona, there are a number of different uses for that curb, for parking two-wheeled vehicles, for a bike track, there's a protection zone. In the back, you can see there's a bici, or the shared bicycle system, rubbish collection, parking or storing a private vehicle, let's call it what it really is, and goods delivery. All of that in this one space. And going forward, we see that with the arrival of new mobility services, well, docked bike sharing is no longer new, but there is pressure on the curb, especially if you consider ride services in a lot of cities around the world. Perhaps not so much here, but if you go to China, if you go to India, if you go travel anywhere in North America, the pressure from ride services at the curb isn't just something that impacts the use of the curb, it's something that impacts other transport modes, like here in San Francisco, where picking up and dropping off can really reduce the capacity and the safety of those infrastructures they've put in place for cycling. So how do we think about moving from a parking city to a pickup and drop-off city? And there are a number of things that came up in our work that relate to that specifically. The first is that we really don't know much about the curb and how it's used. That knowledge is in a number of different departments, and it's often analog, it's not digital. But those uses are multiple, and they can include two-hour parking zones, they can include fire hydrants where you can't park, they can include pickup zones for people with physical disabilities, they can include public transport stops. But all that is all over the place in city departments, and usually coded in paper. There is a need to think about how do we actually code the curb. And this is an example from a project that we did with the Open Transportation Partnership. And it was a way of thinking about what does a space syntax for a city look like that allows any user of that space, the curb in this case, public transport, Lyft, Uber, taxis, the rubbish collectors, to actually provide information in such a way that they don't reveal anything that is commercially sensitive or that's privacy sensitive. And in the end, you get this sort of ability to understand the use of the curb, and because you understand the use of the curb, plan for the use of that curb going forward. We have to think about that space, that invisible space between the street, if you will, and where we walk, as something that is not static, but that's flexible, that's dynamic, and self-adjusting over time. A bit like what we should be thinking about our cities and living spaces as well, self-adjusting dynamic spaces. The curb as it is today is used, as I said, to store private vehicles in most places, sometimes for free, oftentimes in the core parts of the city with different types of prices. We think that going forward, there's a huge role for cities to start thinking about that space as more flexible use zones and allowing that space to change over the course of the day. At night, you have goods deliveries, you have some ride services. In the morning, you have more intense public transport use of the curb, maybe some residual freight services, some breakfast services, people eating their breakfast during the course of the day. Maybe part of that space is used by a food truck, a market. You still have less intense pressure for public transport use and still ride services in the background. And as the evening goes on, you have more and more use for social and for leisure activities. But all that takes place in a zone that before was just storing a number of parked static vehicles. And part of how you move this forward is having that curb coded, but also providing a way in which anyone using the curb can understand immediately what are the rules for using that curb in that instant. And there is a digital translation and a digital broadcast piece to that. Part of that is also pricing the curb, because let's think about it. If you move from a city where, as today, most of the ways in which we can impact demand is through parking pricing, because most of us don't price the kilometers traveled in cities. We don't price the space occupation of vehicles on streets, but we do price when they stop. If that becomes less and less important, then cities lose the most effective tool they have right now to manage traffic. So you have to think about what is the pricing model for every time you interact with a curb. What's the micro fee that is the right one, and how can that be adjusted over time? And for whom should it be higher, and for whom should it be less? Should it be higher for individual use by ride services and less for public transport? But these are questions that cities already should be asking themselves right now, because there will be a negotiation with national authorities on how this actually plays out. And finally, we have to think about new uses. Now, I've listed a number of new uses, and those all tend to be in two-dimensional space, but we've also scarily finished a review of what are the implications for cities around our membership for the broad uptake of commercial uses for drones. We're entering in a period where in the next 20 years we have to think about how you regulate 3D space. And that's something where none of our countries right now are actively involved. But that's some place where cities have to be involved in thinking about under what conditions, under what terms do we allow these new uses. I'll go back to what we heard earlier today. We're talking about what does it mean to be smart? What can we expect from more sharing? And I presented some very extreme cases, 100% sharing. And what might be the implications for thinking about respacing space, respacing curb space, but respacing our city space. We have to keep in mind, and I think every speaker today has hit on this, that that cannot be a technical decision or technical discussion. It has to be value-based. It has to be based on what cities we want, what outcomes we want for people, and what spaces we design so that we create this randomness, so we encourage this chaos, this healthy mixing, this healthy serendipity that are in our cities. We have to make sure that this revolution, the technical revolution, the cultural revolution that we're going through in mobility, instead of dehumanizes us, rehumanizes us going forward. Tack.